Okay. And hopefully share screen. That's the only thing left. There we go. Can people see my screen? Nod. Yeah, I've muted you all, so that doesn't work, does it? Excellent. Got some nods. Good stuff. Give me a shout if anything stops working as we go through. Don't want anyone to be sat there not being able to see things. So welcome everyone. Good evening. And I guess first thing to say is welcome to the first event of this year's Chilterns Festival, which is very exciting. So me talking this evening is, as I'm sure you're all aware, seeing as you signed up, is under the aegis of the Chalk Cherries Chairs project's Chilterns Festival. However, as lots of you know already, I actually work for a different project, but based at the Chilterns Conservation Board with the Chalk Cherries Chairs lot. So I'm here as their sort of first guest speaker, as it were. At the end of the talk, I'll stick up a link to further things coming up with a particular focus on the archaeological things. But I suppose we should make a start. So my name's Ed Peveler, and as I say, I work for the Chilterns Conservation Board, but on the Beacons of the Past project, rather than Chalk Cherries Chairs. This is a different lottery-funded project, still based at the Chilterns Conservation Board, and I'm sure various of you have heard bits and pieces about it already, but the title of this evening's talk is The Secret Archaeology of the Chilterns, Revealing Our Landscape's History Through LiDAR and Citizen Science. So hopefully that sounds exciting, and we'll explain in a second what LiDAR is for those of you who have not come across it before. But essentially, we'll be looking at some of the really exciting new archaeological findings coming out of the Beacons of the Past project. Just to start with a quick introduction to both Beacons of the Past and the Chilterns, in case any of you are familiar with neither. So the Chilterns AONB, the Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty, was first designated in 1965. So we've been in existence for what's that, 55 years now. Is my maths terrible there? No, 55 years, yeah. The AONB covers roughly 838 kilometers squared, so it's sort of up. It's not one of the largest protected landscapes in the UK, but certainly up there. And we stretch over into 4 different counties and border another. So we have bits in Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire, Bedfordshire, and Hertfordshire, and then we have a long sort of border with Berkshire as well, just on the other side of the Thames from us. The landscape is characterized sort of geologically by Cretaceous chalk hills with a steep scarp slope on this northwest facing edge, and then with the gentle dip slope sort of sloping down to the southeast. And coming down that dip slope, as we'll see in more detail in a second, we have a number of dry valleys which were formed during the last ice age when there was more water around and when the ground was permafrosted, so the water flowed across the top of the ground surface. And still existing at the bottom of some of the deeper valleys are some chalk streams where the aquifers are high enough to feed them. Chalk streams themselves being really interesting and sort of protected habitats. I think another key feature of the Chilterns AONB, one that certainly those of you who visit it or live in it will have noticed, is we have relatively high levels of woodland coverage. So the Chilterns is about 21% covered by trees, which is twice the English average. So across England as a whole, we have about 10% average. If you include Scotland, that goes up a bit because lots more of Scotland has trees on, but England itself is about 10%, which actually puts us as one of the lowest in Europe. I think Ireland is possibly one of the only countries with less woodland than us. And we'll come back to that woodland coverage because that I think is very, very important for us and for doing archaeology in the Chilterns. Beacons of the Past then, this project I work on, is, as I said, a National Lottery Heritage funded project. So very grateful to National Lottery players for paying for us to happen. Based at the Chilterns Conservation Board, we started in 2018 and we have 3.5 years of funding. So we've got essentially about a year left to go with the project. We are a team of 2, myself and our project manager, Dr. Wendy Morrison. And the principal kind of remit of the project is to investigate Iron Age archaeology of the Chilterns, and that's very broad and you know, an awful lot of ways we could go with that. But one of the key things that we are using to do this is we've commissioned a very large high-resolution LiDAR survey of the whole of the AONB plus some little extra bits. And as I say, we'll talk about that in more detail shortly, because that's what we're going to be looking at this evening. The project as a whole is sort of doing a whole range of things. So we're doing kind of traditional research approaches, seeing what we can actually learn about the archaeology of the Chilterns. Both Wendy and myself are sort of academic archaeologists by training. But we've also got huge amounts of work going on with regards to public outreach elements. So things like this evening, coming giving talks, giving an awful lot of talks to local societies, groups, volunteers, etc. We're doing lots of work with schools. We were doing lots of work with schools until lockdown happened. Now we need to look into trying to get that started up again. And sort of practical activities, so getting out there and having fun in the landscape. Again, before COVID, this was a lot easier. We need to see whether we can restart things on a smaller scale at some point, potentially next year, I guess now. But we've had fun things like sort of experimental archaeology days, getting out, getting families and kids along to do things like grind their own grain in a prehistoric way, and doing sort of conservation activities. So this was some work up at Pulpit Hill, a National Trust site with a hill fort on it, where we were cutting down ash dieback affected ash saplings and using them to create a lovely kind of very authentic looking wattle fence, essentially, around the hill fort to try and dissuade walking and mountain biking on the ramparts and things like that. So lots of fun that we were having out in the landscape until COVID. Unfortunately, obviously, that put a stop to lots of our practical activities, but as you'll see as we go through this evening, we've still had plenty of things that we can get on with online as well, which has been really handy. So that's kind of a brief introduction to the Chilterns and to the project, but let's turn to this evening's main focus, which is LiDAR. So as I said, about 21% tree cover in the Chilterns, and you can see here, hopefully in the map on the screen, so all these green areas are bits of woodland across the Chilterns AONB, which is sort of outlined with this grey outline coming around here. Of the 838 kilometres squared of the Chilterns, then about a fifth of that is covered by woodland today. And of that woodland, a further sort of 50% of that fifth, so I guess that makes it a tenth, 10% of the Chilterns as a whole, would be classed as ancient woodland. And this is a sort of technical term which is used to describe a piece of land that has been wooded since at least AD 1600. So that's the kind of slightly arbitrary date that's been chosen as our definition for ancient woodland. And we can define our woodlands on this basis, potentially if we can find historic maps or title deeds and things that show us this bit of land has been wooded since then. But actually, in many cases, it's going to be the ecosystem, that the species of plant and tree and the age of trees in the woodland that actually give us the best clues as to how old and how continuously a particular bit of land has been wooded. Now this sort of 10% of the Chilterns as ancient wood, 20% as woodland as a whole. This does two things in my mind as an archaeologist. One, this makes archaeological survey very, very difficult. Trying to spot archaeology when you've got, dense tree cover is really difficult. Lots of archaeology in this country is found through aerial photography, for example, flying over ploughed fields in hot, dry summers where you can see crop marks or parch marks. We've certainly had a lot of those in the last few years. Or being able to go across and walk, out over a ploughed field, and the plough might have brought things like, bits of Roman roof tile or bits of flint work to the surface into the plough soil that we as archaeological field walkers can come across and find and pick up, and then we know there might be an archaeological site in the vicinity. Similarly, even just walking through a landscape and being able to spot, surviving earthworks or bits of wall or, anything else that might indicate we've got a historic or an archaeological site present. When you've got woodland, these things become very difficult. In any direction you look, there's going to be trees in the way. There might be lots of undergrowth, scrub, holly, brambles, that kind of thing, that completely hide your archaeological sites. You don't have ploughing, obviously, to bring finds to the surface. All these things that make life more difficult. The tree canopy will mean that trying to get GPS signal for going out and doing survey makes it very difficult, or using a total station, a sort of digital theodolite. There's always going to be a tree in the way, exactly where you want to try and shoot it in a point. So yeah, woodland makes archaeology difficult. However, it also comes with a bit of a bonus for us, which is that woodland actually preserves archaeology very well. Where we've had ploughed fields, of course, it's going to have been ploughed over year after year. That's going to be completely denuding and damaging any sites that might have existed there. Where we're out in sort of open fields, of course, around the edge of our towns and villages today, they're high risk of being developed into new housing estates, that kind of thing. And this has been going on for hundreds of years, development of settlements, which may have been destroying the signs of earlier occupation. So where we've got woodland, and in particular where we've got ancient woodland, we have fantastic preservation of archaeology. So a really great opportunity that it presents. We just have to find a technique that allows us to go into the woodland and survey it effectively. And that's exactly where LiDAR comes in. So what is LiDAR? How does it work? So LiDAR stands for light, distance, and ranging. A slightly strange acronym, but of course it's related to sort of its sibling techniques of radar and sonar that I'm sure you're all far more familiar with. They sort of have been around a bit longer and used more commonly. So the basic principle is we have in our case, a little light aircraft, something like this. It flies to and fro across the landscape. And it's got a very fancy, expensive piece of kit sort of bolted to the underside of the plane, hopefully nice and securely. And this is doing two main things, really. Number one, it is sending out laser pulses towards the ground. And then number two is it is detecting any reflections that then come back from those laser pulses. So those are its two key jobs. So the basic principle of the technique is, as long as we know where the plane is when a pulse is sent out, since we know the speed of light, we can then calculate, sort of using an offset method, the exact location of the thing off which the pulse has bounced. So we know where the plane is when the pulse comes out, we can time how long it takes to go down, come back again, and that means we can work out exactly where the thing off which the pulse has bounced is in the world. So it's that nice, speed, distance, time triangle that we all did at GCSE maths or O-level maths or whatever. And we've all long forgotten if we don't have to use it. So how do we work out what the plane is? Well, we do two things really. So number one, we have a GPS on board the plane, and really good high accuracy industrial standard GPS that is talking to satellites up in space. We also have a system on board that is talking to a GPS base station that will have been surveyed in as accurately as we can on the ground somewhere underneath where the plane is flying. And then that is also talking to the satellites. So we're kind of trying to triangulate things, in as many ways as possible to get really, really good precision on where exactly the plane is at any given moment. And with that as well, feeding into those calculations is this thing called the IMU, the inertial measurement unit on board the plane. And that's a little sensor that is working out all the exact sort of tiny movements of the plane. So its pitch and its yaw and roll and things like that as it's moving through the air, because obviously whilst they're trying to fly in a nice straight line, differences in air pressure, wind speed, etc., will be making the plane move a little bit as it's flying along. So with all these extra bits of kit, we can hopefully work out to a very, very high level of precision where exactly the plane is at any given moment at which a laser pulse is sent out. And in doing so, we can then work out where the thing on the ground is. Just to make things a bit more exciting, let's look at the laser pulses themselves. The ones we used for our survey were near infrared wavelength laser pulses. So pretty much like a laser pointer you'd use on a if I was giving this presentation in a village hall somewhere, like we used to in the old days. Similar to that, just a bit higher powered, really. Now these pulses, we're not just sending out one every few minutes, just to get one measurement as we go, as we go along. These pulses are coming out of our fancy bit of kit on the bottom of the plane at, in the case of the kit, we used 2 megahertz. So that's 2 million pulses every second coming out of our laser scanner on the bottom of the plane. So that's quite a lot of laser pulses being sent down and just sort of covering the landscape with recordings, essentially. And they don't come out just vertically, out the bottom of the plane. They're being sent out in what we call a scan pattern. So some sensors might use a scan pattern like this one illustrated here, a sort of zigzag side to side. The one we used actually had sort of a series of circles overlapping each other, sort of concentric circles. And these can come out up to about 14 degrees either side of vertical. So if you imagine, vertical line out the middle of the plane, we're scanning up to about 14 degrees either side of vertical. So that gives us a swath width of 100 meters or so, 150 meters or so by the time it reaches the ground. So we call this a swath or a swathe, kind of that footprint that comes out underneath the plane on any given sort of flight path. So as you can see, we're sort of saturating the ground with laser pulses, and once the plane is flown in one direction, it'll then turn around and fly back in the other direction, sort of slightly overlap with the previous swath, so we can match all those data points together and make sure we're getting consistent readings. And then the final thing, just to make the whole thing even more complicated and even more useful from our point of view, is that each laser pulse that comes out of the plane, plane's flying about 1,000 meters up, and when the laser pulse leaves the plane, they're about 1 millimeter in diameter. But that laser pulse kind of diverges slightly as it comes down. Each laser pulse is diverging slightly as it comes down towards the ground. And so by the time it reaches the ground, the footprint of each laser pulse is about 30 centimeters in diameter. So imagine sort of a dinner plate on the ground for every single one of those 2 million laser pulses a second coming out of our plane. And what this means, having this kind of relatively wide area or footprint for each laser pulse, the sensor is clever enough to detect when it receives only a partial return from each footprint, and it can then receive further returns from that footprint. So just to give you probably a slightly better illustration of that, we've got a side-on cross-section through one single laser pulse being sent down towards the ground. Whilst part of that laser pulse may hit a branch or a leaf somewhere high up in the tree canopy and reflect back to the plane, giving us a reading, giving us a point. There is something here. The rest of that 30 centimeter dinner plate is going to carry on down towards the ground. And of course, some more of that footprint may be reflected back by a branch lower in the canopy, and then again, down into lower scrub and things like that, smaller bushes, be reflecting part of that footprint. The hope is, though, that as that laser pulse comes down, whilst some of it may be returned to the plane as reflections, we get some part of that sort of 30 centimeter diameter circle making its way down to ground level and giving us a reading of where exactly the ground is, in that part of the landscape. And as I said, our sensor that we use could have up to 24 discrete returns. So not just 1, 2, 3, 4. It could have 24 different reflections that make it back to the plane from each single pulse. So that's 48 million data points possibly being created every single second by our plane flying backwards and forwards. And the total flight time was about 2 weeks, I think. So an awful lot of data being created. So the purposes of all this is essentially we end up with millions and millions, billions of points of where our lasers have reflected off something in the landscape. So it might look a bit like this when we take all that data. So this is simplified. We can't see all the points in here, but we can see an awful lot of them. You can see there's so many of them, you can barely distinguish individual points in here. And you can see we've got a whole load that have reflected off here, the top of trees. You can see lots of trees out here. You can see we've got a whole load that have reflected off the top of buildings. So you can see we've got roofs here. And then you can see we've got a whole load that have reflected off the ground surface as well. What this means is we can run some very clever spatial statistics across this whole data set of points and filter out the different things that we think our laser has reflected off. So we can try and work out from this what we call point cloud, what in this point cloud is tree, what in this point cloud is building, and what in this point cloud is ground surface. Because for us as archaeologists, it's the ground surface is what we're interested in. That's where we're going to be able to spot archaeological earthworks. So we can use, as I said, spatial statistical algorithms to kind of filter through the data set and try and work out what falls into these different categories of tree, vegetation, buildings, or ground surface. And then once we've done that, we can just get rid of all those points that are trees or buildings and just leave ourselves with, hopefully, a relatively nice ground surface showing all the lumps and bumps that might be hidden archaeology of some sort or other. I guess important things to note here, obviously where we have tree canopies, whilst we're flying this survey in the winter so that the leaves are off all of our deciduous trees so we can get as many pulses getting down to the ground as possible, we will have a lower point density reaching the ground where we have trees in the way. So you can see around this edge here where we had beech woodland, beech trees, you can see we've got sort of a lower point density along here. Also worth pointing out, where we have buildings, of course, there's no way that that laser pulse can get through the roof of a house at all, can it? All of our 24 returns are going to be straight back off the roof for each laser pulse. And so we end up with these sort of shadows, these holes in our data set underneath where there are buildings. That's just something we're going to have to live with. And the other thing, just to reinforce as well, the laser pulses don't penetrate anything. They're not ground penetrating. They don't go through wood, they don't go through leaves. We're simply aiming to sort of fire enough of them at the ground that we get between leaves and we get between branches. So those are kind of some of the core principles that go into creating our point cloud. Hopefully that will make sense. There'll be time for questions at the end if anyone wants me to come back to that if I haven't explained it quite clearly enough. So we've now got our what we call our classified point cloud of just our ground points. Now it's not very nice to look at, is it, this? You can't really make out a lot of what's going on. We've got all these holes, so we kind of want to fill in the holes. We're going to interpolate across where we have the holes, kind of join the dots essentially from side to side to fill in the gaps to make this look a bit nicer. And we're just going to join the dots between every single point in here to make a solid surface, because a solid surface is much easier for us as humans with a human eye to look at. And there's a whole way of different, whole number of different surfaces that we might be able to make from our data set. One of them might be what we call a digital surface model. So this is what we'd get if we essentially joined the dots across what we might call our first return from each laser pulse, so across the tops of the tree canopy. So you can see here we're looking at a landscape in 3D, and the sides of this hill here are all completely covered in trees. You can see we've got sort of hedge line along here with some bigger outgrown trees in it as well. There'll be buildings showing up in this as well. There's a little village down here which will have buildings showing up. So that's our DSM, our digital surface model. But again, not very useful for us as archaeologists because we want to see what's underneath that tree canopy, don't we? So we get rid of all those vegetation points, get rid of all the building points, and we create what we call our digital terrain model. We've got the wax strips out and taken it across the landscape and removed all that vegetation. So it's what we call our bare earth model of the landscape. And this is what we're excited about. This is where we're going to be able to spot archaeology. So we could look at them in 3D like this, but this is quite difficult and data intensive for your computer to have to run. And it's not necessarily all that easy to spot variation in the earthworks here either. And so we then go through a final step, which is to take our DTM, our digital terrain model, which is in essence just the raw data of how high above sea level is every point in the Chilterns, across the whole area. So we've essentially created a grid across the Chilterns that has cells of 25 centimeters by 25 centimeters and worked out the average height above sea level for every single of those 25 centimeter by 25 centimeter cells across the whole Chilterns. So we can tell you exactly the height anywhere across the Chilterns, very, very precisely as well. So with an error margin of about probably 15 centimeters at most. And so we then take that DTM and we process it into what we call visualizations, specialist visualizations that allow us to show up variations in elevation more clearly, because that way we might hope to spot archaeology, lumps and bumps, earthworks more clearly. If we've really zoomed out, so you can see here we've got a scale of 4 kilometers, then we get an image like this across the Chilterns. This is, believe it or not, this is the M40 just running down here. So this is High Wycombe just in here. So it's the thing that immediately jumps out, of course, is all these dry valleys. So these are those dry valleys created during the last ice age, when the ground was permafrosted and lots of glacial meltwater flooding out the bottom of the glaciers and really quickly eroding through the chalk. As soon as ice age ends, ground thaws through again, the chalk becomes permeable, and so the streams disappear underground into the aquifer, and we're left with this fantastic dendritic structure across the whole landscape. And of course, in the deeper valleys, so this is the Y Valley down here, of course, there still are streams, at least, when things are wet and the water companies haven't over abstracted too much water. So that's what we get when we're zoomed out. But of course, for us as archaeologists, not all that useful unless you really wanted to study the course of the M40. So we need to zoom in a bit. And this is where we start to see, the really exciting stuff. So here we're in at a scale of you can see 200 meters here on the scale bar. And this is a slightly different visualization type from the previous one. In this one, this is what we'd call a hillshade. So we've sort of shone sunlight across the landscape and seen where it casts shadows. And we've actually shone sunlight from 3 different directions in this particular image to give that sort of 3D effect and to show things up a bit better. This particular image, instead of sort of shining a light and casting shadows, we have essentially calculated what the places in the landscape that are relatively high or low compared to the surrounding landscape. So in essence, what this means is where things are white, it means they are positive features, so they are banks or mounds above sort of the surrounding terrain. And where things are darker, where things are black, it means they are ditches or pits, so they're negative features relative to the surrounding terrain. And this means we get all sorts of lumps and bumps showing up across the whole landscape. And in this particular image, we've got things from a number of different periods as well. We'll have a look in a second at some sort of more detailed different period stuff, but just to tell you what's in this particular image. So you can see we've got a sort of ditch running down through the middle of this image with a bank to the right hand side to the east. Hopefully everyone could make that out. So we've got a ditch running down here with a bank to the right. People can see my mouse, I hope, so you can see what I'm pointing at. Yes, you can. So that, we don't really know what this is. It is a relatively old ditch and bank feature. It's possibly Iron Age, possibly Roman in date. And we're saying this based on the fact it has a relationship to these ditches and banks just up here in the sort of the top right here, because we know that this is a Roman farmstead or villa site. There was some excavation done on this in the mid-20th century by some schoolboys, interestingly enough. So not the highest quality excavation ever done, but obviously fantastic that people got out there and were interested in this stuff. And so they excavated some of this site, and there are apparently some standing walls still visible as well, or maybe covered in earth and leaf litter now. So this is a Roman villa site. And so this feature coming down here seems to tie into kind of this ditch running in here. And so the assumption is that potentially these are trackways, or potentially these are sort of boundary ditches connected to a maybe late Iron Age or Roman rural landscape of kind of villas or farmsteads, routeways and field systems, presumably. Elsewhere in the image, we have this interesting square ditch around here. I don't believe this has ever been excavated. So we kind of just have to take a bit of a guess as to what it is. But it is recorded in the Buckinghamshire or Hertfordshire Historic Environment Record as a Roman temple, or a Romano-Celtic temple, square being the classic shape for these things. Whether that is true or not, I'm not entirely convinced that there is the excavation evidence. I think there has been some Roman pottery found, so Roman date is reasonable, but whether it's a temple or not, I think probably still needs a little bit of investigation. Elsewhere in the image, though, completely different period of archaeology. I don't know if anyone's got any ideas what these things might be. Feel free to type into chat if you've got any ideas what these funny sort of wiggly lines are going up and down across the landscape. Any ideas? World War I trenches, yes, lots of people getting it. Exactly. So these are remnants of World War I training trenches dug on, this is Berkhamsted Common, during World War I by the squaddies when they're training before heading off to the front line, to the Western Front. And the Chilterns was an ideal place for doing this training because, of course, the chalk of the Chilterns is pretty much identical to the geology that you have on the Western Front. So a useful place for them to be practicing. But rather sobering sort of archaeology coming up in the LiDAR as well. Just to show you what this looks like in aerial photo. Did any of you guess that we were looking at a golf course? This is Berkhamsted Golf Course. And you can actually see, for example, some of those World War I training trenches as earthworks in the aerial image here. So you can see those coming up. And we can actually see some of our sort of big, long ditch and bank feature coming down here. I'll just flick back to the LiDAR image. So you can see, we can see some of these things where they're out in the open, where the satellite imagery, similarly the square ditch, that possible Romano Celtic temple, that is out there in the open as well. So where there's no tree cover, we can see these things fine and spot them from a plane. But of course, where we've got the woodland, these become very, very difficult to see. So yeah, and Berkhamsted Golf Course, I think, is a fantastic example of a golf course that hasn't done too much in the way of sort of terraforming. Lots of golf courses completely dig up the whole landscape in order to build their fairways and their bunkers and things like that. Obviously, there's a bit here at Berkhamsted, so you can see some of these rectangular things. These are obviously tees.
These are fun, or it would be the way they were learning.
Oh, someone's unmuted themselves. Bear with me a second. I'll just.
Me, sorry.
That's right. Thanks, Bill. So some of these are tees, but obviously on the whole, lots of this archaeology survives because they haven't bulldozed the whole lot. So that's always nice. So how are we using this data? So we've flown 1,400 kilometers squared of high resolution LiDAR data. And this is actually the largest survey. As far as you know, it's the largest survey of its kind yet flown in the UK. So with our 25 centimeter resolution, no one else has flown a survey quite this large in the UK. So that's quite exciting, quite a good claim to fame. We, of course, want to use this data to find and map archaeological sites. Of course, surviving as earthworks. We can't find archaeology that's buried. We can only find archaeology that survives as earthworks. In part for research purposes, and in part for trying to get these things protected. So getting them into the local historic environment records, so they're in databases so that people know that they're there when it comes to new housing estates going up or anything like that. Railways going through, etc. We're not the first AONB to have done this. So Cannock Chase AONB a few years ago, they flew 129 kilometers squared of LiDAR. And in doing so, they discovered 436 new archaeological sites. North Pennines AONB a few years ago flew 234 kilometers squared of LiDAR, and in doing so found 1,865 new archaeological sites. As I say, we've flown 1,400 kilometers squared of even higher resolution LiDAR than they did. So how many sites are we going to find? So we've made the data publicly viewable. It's far too much for me and Wendy to analyze. So we've actually made the data publicly viewable through what we're quite proud of. Is we think it's very much a first of its kind sort of citizen science web portal or web app to allow anyone to log on, look at our Chilterns data. There's tutorials on there to help you sort of understand how to read it. And the aim is that you record things into this web portal to help us find archaeological sites that have never been mapped before. We launched the portal back in August 2019, so we've been going a year and a month now. And in that time, our fantastic volunteers have racked up well over 2,000 hours of work on the portal. And in doing so, they've mapped over 10,000 possible archaeological features. So we really do owe a great debt to lots of our really dedicated volunteers who have put many, many hours into searching this data and coming up with some fantastic results. So just going to show you some of those results now. And the most exciting one, I'll come back to the website, don't worry, we'll link it again at the end. Oh yeah, sorry, slide in between. So what have we been finding? We found archaeology from all periods. So whilst the Beacons of the Past project is focusing on the Iron Age in particular, so this period between about 800 BC and when the Romans turn up in AD 42. But the LiDAR survey, of course, is finding everything from Neolithic archaeology, so 4000 BC, all the way through to 20th century stuff like the World War I practice trenches, World War II training camps, resettlement camps, all that kind of thing, and even some more recent stuff than that, that we would happily class as archaeology. And together, these are creating an amazing new picture of work, life, kind of use, exploitation of the Chilterns landscape over 6,000 years. And we think this is really going to change the narrative that we can tell about the history and the archaeology of the Chilterns. Of course, there's plenty of sites that were already known, already recorded in the historic environment records, already scheduled sites, etc. But the LiDAR itself has also, really enriched what we can tell about a lot of these, because any that were in woodland, were really difficult to visualize. They had to have, earthwork surveys, and not many sites had earthwork surveys. The LiDAR, just off the bat, gives us a fantastic new view and a measured view. We can use these things for doing, proper measured survey. of those earthworks, many of which, as I say, deeply hidden in woodland, many of which poorly understood, poorly mapped, poorly recorded, sometimes mapped in the wrong place, because obviously when you're without getting good GPS, you're going to not be able to quite tell where on the map you are when you map these things. So we can find records, scheduled sites that when we use the LiDAR, we can see that they've been mapped 50 meters in the wrong place, that kind of thing. Or half the site has fallen outside of the scheduled area because it's been mapped in the wrong place. But obviously the stuff that we're really excited about, get our Indiana Jones hats on, all the new archaeology that's coming to light. From, as I say, the relatively mundane to many people. I'm very nerdy, so I get excited by a lot of these things. Things like chalk quarries, clay pits, saw pits, just evidence of everyday use of the Chilterns through history. Through, I think, to what many people would regard as the really exciting things. So enclosures in particular, people get really excited about, potentially later prehistoric Roman settlement sites. We are dramatically, I think, well, in an infinite way, increasing what's known about prehistoric farming in the Chilterns, because as far as I'm aware, we didn't have a single prehistoric field system recorded in the Chilterns. We've found loads and loads and loads with the LiDAR, because it's sensitive enough, because it's able to get us into that woodland. We can suddenly spot these amazing field systems that are buried in ancient woods. So some really, really exciting things coming to light. The one that we're really proud of, that we announced back in August, sort of at the anniversary of the portal being online, was we have found, we're very 99.9% confident we have identified a new Iron Age hill fort in the Chiltern Hills. This is something that when the project started, it was kind of a bit of a dream. It was kind of pie in the sky that we might find a new hill fort. Hill forts are relatively large features. They might be a couple of 100 meters across with earthworks. As you can see here, this is me standing on top of this earthwork of our new hill fort. This is, I'm 1 meter 90 tall. This is a 2 meter measuring stick next to me. So you can see these are not small earthworks. We expected that all the people working in the Chilterns will have found these things in the past. But we've discovered one that was not recorded, which we're really excited about. I'm afraid I can't show you any more images of it because the landowner wants us to keep its location hidden for the moment so that they can ensure it gets protected. They don't want people trespassing on it, that kind of thing. But hopefully in the near future, we'll be able to reveal a bit more information about this particular site. But we're really pleased about this one and very chuffed to get on the BBC News website as well, me and my mask. But some of the other images I can share with you, some really, really exciting sites coming to light. So here, just to explain what you can see here, hopefully all of you can make out, we've got a little rectangular thing down here with a sort of secondary arm coming off the side here. So these are dark, so of course these are ditches in this particular visualization type. So this is obviously a rectilinear enclosure of some sort with a kind of annex enclosure that doesn't fully close. And there's actually a second one just up here, again, rectilinear enclosure at the top there with a sort of tail coming off it that doesn't fully enclose a sort of second area. Obviously this one has been damaged rather by some features coming through here. So these are much later features. I can explain what those are in a second. But these are really exciting because they weren't known before, not mapped, and they're not subtle features. These are quite large ditches. They're probably about 2-3 meters across this ditch and probably 50 centimeters deep. So a relatively obvious thing, but it just hadn't been recorded as far as we can find. There's no written records. It's not in any database of there being these ditched sites here. Whilst we can't date them from the LiDAR data alone, we can only look at their sort of morphology. What shape is it? What size is it? What does it look like compared to known excavated examples of archaeological enclosures? And so we're pretty sure that these are either late Iron Age or Roman in date, presumably rural settlement of some sort, so lower status than a villa, some kind of rural settlement where some farmers are living, probably. Elsewhere in this image, can you make out, this one will require a bit more squinting perhaps. So just to point out actually, so this is woodland, this is the edge of the woodland running around here. And then this is ploughed field to the northeast here. So we've got ploughed field out here and then woodland in here. And so you can see really clearly the preservation that woodland gives us. So where that ploughed field comes in here, obviously our poor little late Iron Age or Roman ditch has been completely obliterated by ploughing. It's been ploughed out, filled in, completely flattened. But where we're in ancient woodland, it's been beautifully preserved. Over here, this is also woodland, as you can see, just around here to the south of where I'm drawing my cursor now. We've got more woodland. Can people make out? We've got some very faint white lines running through the woodland here. Can people see that? And then through there, we've got a sort of a slightly negative feature, a slightly darker area running in between two white lines running through there, and then possibly another one sort of running down here. So this is one of those prehistoric or Roman field systems. So these are little, very low banks. These probably only survived to 10, 20 centimeters high now, spread over a meter or so, 2 meters or so in width. Probably basically a sort of mounding of flint at the edges of the fields, because they obviously don't want to be hitting it with their ard or their plough. So they're mounding up the flint around the edges of their fields and to enclose their fields to delineate what belongs to who. And these have survived, heavily eroded, but survived through to today in woodland where they haven't been ploughed away. And they're almost impossible to spot if you were to go and visit this site on the ground. I reckon I could bet you money that you would walk into this woodland and you would really struggle to see these features. They'd be that subtle. But with the LiDAR, we can make these things really clear. You can see they carry on down here, a few more down here, getting really subtle across here. And then these negative features running through here, these are trackways. So this is a little trackway running in between two of those field boundaries, running up here. And so from the fact that we're dealing with ancient woodland, so this has been wooded since at least AD 1600. From the shape and size of the fields, these are very small rectangular fields, which is characteristic of what we call a coaxial field system, which is typically going to be dating to either later prehistory or the Roman period, possibly the early medieval period. And obviously, given our vicinity, our proximity, to what we think are late Iron Age or Roman rural settlement, is it reasonable to make an assumption that these potentially are contemporary with our little enclosures over here? And so these represent Roman field systems going on as well. So really, really exciting stuff that, as I said, hadn't really been identified in the Chilterns before. It was assumed either that people weren't farming up here or that just nothing had survived. Another example here, hopefully you'll be getting your eye in now. You can see more of these little faint white lines crisscrossing across the landscape, making little rectangular fields. So again, we assume later prehistoric or Roman field system based on the morphology of it. But this one's rather fun and different because it's got these little black circles kind of at the corners or along the edges of these fields. So these are pits. As I said, black means negative. So these are little circular pits, and these are relatively deep, surviving still to a meter deep probably. Obviously, originally we'd assume they'd be much deeper than that. So these are probably quarry pits, and as far as we can tell, they're probably extracting chalk from them. We assume maybe for liming the fields, so adding the chalk to the field to improve the fertility. But really interesting the way that they've been dug at the corners of these fields like this, and every single field sort of seems to have them. So our understanding of this is that presumably every owner of every field just had to dig their pit in their field. They didn't have one great big communal quarry where everyone could come and take away the chalk for liming their fields. I guess to make things as efficient as possible in terms of moving the stuff, they just dug their pits right there at the edges of their field. It's nice to see this because the South Downs National Park, they ran a LiDAR project about 5-6 years ago now, and they identified the exact same thing in Bronze Age, Iron Age and Roman field systems. These little chalk pits at the corners of these coaxial field systems. So quite nice to see that continuity, see that same practice going on here. And we've got another intriguing sort of set of enclosure ditches down here. I've got no idea how to make any sense of this. We've got a rectilinear enclosure, sort of trapezoidal enclosure down here at the southeastern edge. Obviously, two sides of that have been heavily damaged because there's actually modern forestry on top of this part of the enclosure, and you can see some of those lines of the modern forestry activity going on there. And then in doing that, they've sort of damaged these parts of the ditch. But you can see that the northern and western sides are still nicely preserved of this interesting trapezoidal enclosure. And that's nestled really tightly up against this very irregular sort of curving enclosure around here, sort of weird globular thing, with a ditch and bank. You can see there's sort of ditch on the outside, bank on the inside, whereas our rectilinear enclosure is really just a ditch. It doesn't really have a bank. It's got sort of a very slight bank on either side. But our globular thing is ditch on the outside, bank on the inside, and weird stuff going on in the middle. Can't really make sense of the earthworks going on in the middle. So again, I can't really date this thing from the LiDAR alone. It's possible that the it could be sort of related to medieval activity in the woodland, maybe hunting lodge or something like that. Or alternatively, it's something that's potentially contemporary with our prehistoric or Roman field system, and it's rural settlement again of some sort. Those are sort of the two possibilities in my mind. But as I say, to really understand it, we'd need to go and dig some holes to find things out. Another really exciting find, a previously unidentified alignment of a major Roman road. So can everyone see running straight through the center of this image? This really nice straight white line that runs through here, and you can actually trace it, further through the landscape in both directions. But this is the best preserved bit because here we're in ancient woodland. So the white bit, of course, is what we call the agger, so the sort of mounded carriageway of the road itself. And then rather nicely, I don't know if you'll be able to make out on your screens, can you see it, particularly in this part here, we've got a little alignment of pits alongside the road as well. So just coming up on the south side of the road, you can see we've got a little alignment of tiny little pits. And this is really interesting because other Roman roads across the country, similar things have been found, and the general interpretation is that these are quarry pits for quarrying out the material for surfacing the road itself. So the geology here, there's going to be gravel potentially up here, and so they're digging out the gravels from these pits to use as the sort of cobbled surface for the road itself. So that's a rather lovely thing, and it's a really major road that in all the maps of Roman roads across this part of the country, it was drawn in completely the wrong place. So they'd sort of just drawn a spurious line, try and join two dots, and had missed essentially. So that's really exciting and really does sort of change what we understand about the organization of this part of the Chilterns in the Roman period and the use of it for moving. There's lots else going on in this particular image, which I guess is worth talking about. So we've got more of these little faint white lines that hopefully you can make out running through here. So that's more of that field system. Whether it predates or is sort of contemporary with the road, I think is very difficult to make out. There's maybe a suggestion that you might have a boundary going across here, in which case well, yeah, there's sort of some various ways that we could look at it to try and work out whether the field system predates the Roman road as sort of a Bronze Age or Iron Age field system that the Roman road then comes and cuts through and ignores and damages, or was it a field system that was in use contemporaneously with the road and kind of respects it and uses it. Elsewhere in the image, to make the things even more confusing than our Roman road, our field system that's possibly earlier, we've actually got a little enclosure just surviving up there, or half of it's surviving there, other half cut away by the road and being plowed away. So potentially does that date to sort of contemporary with the field system? Again, we can't really say, but nice thing to find. But then overlying the whole lot, can you see we've got this kind of stripy texture going on across, particularly here, these are really clear, these stripes here, and then we've got some north-south stripes here. This is medieval ridge and furrow ploughing. And it goes straight across the top of the Roman road, as you can see. So at some point, presumably in the, I guess, between 1066 and the Tudor period, let's say, this was completely ploughed up. The road was ploughed up, no longer in use. And this was farmed. And then at some point, the farming goes out of use, and this all reverts back to being woodland, because this again is ancient woodland. It's wooded by AD 1600. So that ridge and furrow predates 1600. So a really lovely kind of complex stratigraphy of different phases of use of this part of the landscape, with some really beautiful relationships that you can see that help you date the different bits. I'll finish shortly, but just a few more examples. Same stuff again. Field systems, lovely field system. And then a lovely enclosure just off at the side here with a great big bank on the inside, ditch around the outside, and then a sort of secondary enclosure. This is medieval. This has been excavated by archaeology in Marlow. And I think 12th, 13th, 14th century pottery has come out of the site. So a medieval date, obviously, a squarely medieval date. How we interpret it as a site, I think, is quite challenging. The LiDAR, I think, has certainly aided in our view of the site, and archaeology in Marlow's view of the site. I think there were some sort of ditches and banks in here that the LiDAR has really helped us get a much better view of. And I guess, the assumption is either it's a farmstead, so it's in a rural settlement, rural landscape. Is it something in a woodland, so i.e. it is potentially part of a hunting landscape, because again, we're in ancient woodland here, so it was wooded by AD 1600. So question is, was it wooded before that, and then this is built in woodland and therefore might be part of a hunting landscape, hunting lodge type thing? And actually the sort of arrangement of this, it almost has the appearance of what we might call moated sites, defended site of some sort, because that great big bank and ditch within a sort of outer enclosure, almost looks Motte and Bailey-esque, or at least, major enclosure and then Bailey-esque. So it's a defended site of some sort. It's a really, really intriguing one there from sort of that high medieval period. And then I saw in the chat someone mentioned World War I training trenches near Marlow. These are they, so some more World War I practice trenches just on the edge of Marlow Common. Fantastic, amazing length of things. There's about 2.5 kilometers, I think, in total length of training trenches here. There's a nice little sign that was put up by, I think, Archaeology in Marlow again, just down near here. Well worth a visit. And then World War II stuff as well. So this is a site that I'm sure some of you will have driven past and maybe even have walked over. This is at Ashridge, just above Berkhamsted National Trust site. And this is the main monument drive up to the main car park, which is just up here. And then this is called Barracks Car Park, and you'd never guess why. It's because hiding in the woodland either side of the car park, which is the parade ground for the barracks, we have the footprint and the tracks remaining, the paths remaining. And I think you can see these on the ground as well if you go and visit, of all these barrack blocks and the sort of paths connecting them. And all the things going around, so a little sort of D-shaped path coming around there. So really, really satisfying shape to this barrack block. I really like the sort of different angles. It almost looks like it was designed by an architect. It's quite amazing. So stuff from all periods, really. So no matter what you're interested in, we've probably got something that will do it for you. Seeing as we're doing this as part of the Chalk Cherries Chairs Chiltern Festival, I guess I should probably finish with Chalk Cherries Chairs. So chalk, lovely image of Kensworth chalk quarry, cement quarry, obviously 20th century, 21st century quarrying of the chalk for cement manufacture, just near Dunstable. I just think it looks amazing, this stunning kind of landscape of terraces and where they've been excavating all the chalk out. So that's the chalk. But of course, as I'm sure lots of you have noticed across many of our images, we've got pits everywhere in the Chilterns. So here you can see divot, funny irregular shaped divot, pits, 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 pits. The whole Chilterns is just covered in holes, pits, 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 all the way around here. The Chilterns has just been quarried and quarried and quarried for its chalk, for its clay, for gravel, all these sorts of things being dug out depending on where they're deposited. So chalk pits everywhere, not necessarily great big modern ones like this. Cherries, quite hard to spot in the LiDAR, but I found one example. This is an old cherry orchard that has been cut down, but you can still see these little hummocks, which is where every single tree was planted on a little mound. I can't guarantee that they were cherry trees. There may be apple or pear or plum, or Aylesbury prune even, but certainly fruit trees of some sort that were planted as an orchard that have since been cut down. So that's a rather lovely one. And then to finish with the chairs, again, challenging to find chairs in the LiDAR. Best thing I could come up with was the Chilterns is covered, all our Chiltern woodlands are covered in saw pits. So these are generally post-medieval in date, probably majority 18th century, 19th century in date. These little elongated pits, you can see little elongated black dot, sort of oval black dot with a little white mound next to it. So that's the pit itself, and then the spoil heap that was sort of mounded up next to it, where the spoil was removed. And as I say, Chiltern woodlands are just filled with these things. Really, really interesting sites. And actually, SOAG, South Oxfordshire Archaeology Group, have this week, I believe, started to excavate one as well, because these things are so seldom excavated because people just assume they're not very interesting. So keen to keep an eye on. I'll try and retweet their stuff, or if you're on Twitter, or we'll keep an eye on what comes out of their excavation of their saw pit. As I say, really, really interesting things. Part of the timber converting tradition of the Chilterns. You'd fell your tree and then be converting the timber up in the woods into the different pieces that you want. Because obviously it's much easier to bring out already converted than it is to bring out the whole log and convert it down near where you need it. And of course the bodgers, the chair makers, will be using many of the smaller branches that are coming from the large timber trees. So just to finish then, still plenty of time to get involved, and please do. We've got so much work still to do. We've got 10,000 sites. There are at least double that still to record. So please do come and get involved. That's a plea of desperation. So there's that website again for you. We are recording this, so we'll make sure a link gets emailed out to everyone with the recording and with that that link in there. So come and register for free. It's very easy. chilternsbeacons.org. That home page when you register will have sort of the basic instructions of how to get started. As you can see from the image down here, there's tutorials on there to get started. There's a forum, so you can come and post what you're finding and discuss it with other users of the website. There's a blog page, which I have had a little lull, I haven't updated in a while, so I'll make sure I get doing that again. And then to access the LiDAR data, it's under this thing called the Citizen Science Portal. We've then got a second stage of the citizen science process, which is that our more experienced users are then helping us to review all those results that are coming in from our citizens and then turning that into our master database, which will be our kind of nice, neat, quality controlled database that we can then give to the county HERs, Historic England, to landowners, to researchers, that kind of thing, to help get our sites protected and research more. You can also sign up for our mailing list. If you just Google Beacons of the Past, I think you'll find us, or Chilterns AONB projects, Beacons of the Past, and I'll be sending an email out probably tomorrow with an update of upcoming talks and workshops and things like that, because I do run these regularly. So I have training workshops for the LiDAR portal and for various other topics as well that I do every month. And we have these things called mapathons, where essentially just a whole group of volunteers just get together often on a Friday via Microsoft Teams or Zoom or something. And we just talk about what we found in the LiDAR that week, whether we've got any sites that we don't quite understand, if we want some advice on something, if we've run into a problem, that kind of thing. So always good fun to share and learn from each other. And we've had fantastic knowledge coming out because, I mean, part of the reason we wanted to do this as citizen science was because there's so much knowledge in the community. People who have lived and worked in the Chilterns for decades, who have researched it, they know far more than I do because I've only been working here for 3 years. So it's been fantastic hearing all these stories from people who are really intimately connected with the landscape. And then just to finish, just to encourage you all to sign up for more of the Chilterns Festival events. I've cherry-picked some of the archaeology ones here. So, but you can go and see the full program on chilternsAONB.org/CCC-fest. Of course, there's this exciting news of a new heritage trail around Wickham Rye being created with Wickham Museum. Chilterns Walking Festival is starting up very soon. That's all being done in lovely COVID-safe ways. And there's so many historic and archaeological themed walks in there as well worth signing up for, and most of them are free. And then some more archaeology talks coming up as part of the festival. Sam Johansson's doing a couple. He's doing a talk on the 9th of October on Grimsditch. He's doing a walk on the 15th of October about routes to the past, so looking at sunken ways and old routeways in the Chilterns. And then on the 24th of October, kind of the keynote thing, is we have this Citizen Science Conference taking place, the Chilterns Champions Conference. So myself and Wendy will be presenting at that as well, and Chris Packham will be there. And so you can come along and hear about all sorts of different types of citizen science that have been happening in the Chilterns, whether that's nature and ecology or archaeology. We've got a lot. But thanks ever so much for listening. We've got time for questions now. I'll end the recording. So feel free to type your questions in chat, probably the easiest thing. And then if we've got time, if we run out of questions, we can have a look at the website as well, if people want to do that. But thanks ever so much for listening. Do ask any questions.